Good afternoon. Welcome. I am Rosanna McFadden. I'm happy to be here with you and recognize many of you. Thank you for coming out this afternoon. I am the pastor of Creekside Church of the Brethren. It's in Elkhart. I live in Goshen, so about an hour north of here. My presentation, as you might have figured out, is Blessed, the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm going to be talking about an opportunity that I had for a sabbatical project in the summer of 2022. So some of you may be familiar with the Sabbath Rest program that is sponsored by Eli Lilly. I applied for that grant for sabbatical travel and was away from my congregation for June, July, and August. So I'm going to show you some slides of my travels and talk to you about the project, which was to do a manuscript, a hand-lettered manuscript of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7. I was a lettering artist before I went into pastoral ministry. And I knew that if I had a project to do, this would be something that I'd never have the time to do otherwise. So I have the original manuscript with me. It is on the table out in the foyer. If you are interested when we're done at 4:30 and want to see that manuscript, I would love to share it with you. I also have some of the tools and things that I use to create it. I just ask that you let me turn the pages of the manuscript. It is currently unbound. The pages are not delicate, but oils from your hands can discolor them over time. So I'll go right out there when we're done here. You don't have to stay, but I would be delighted if you want to. This is my husband, Tim, and I. We were in Edinburgh. We spent most of our travel time in Scotland. We dipped into northeastern England, the Borders country, and I'll show you just a few pictures of some of the hiking, some of the scenery that we saw while we were there. But first, the reason to go to Scotland was twofold. Our family name, McFadden, is a clan name that comes from Scotland. My brother-in-law, David, had been doing some genealogy research, and it turns out all the McFaddens come from one area of Scotland on the Isle of Mull. So that's one of the places that we traveled at the end. But the Isle of Mull is close to the island of Iona, which is where the Book of Kells was created. If you are familiar with that manuscript, it's a hand-lettered manuscript and decorated manuscript of the Gospels. It's considered one of the greatest treasures of the Western world. Of all of them, it is currently in Ireland at Trinity College, Dublin. It is the most visited thing in Ireland for tourists who come to Ireland. So it was created on what is now the Scottish island of Iona. And I was interested in visiting that place where that had been created. If you can see here, here is the Isle of Mull. And this tiny little spot is the island of Iona. So in order to get to Mull, you have to take a ferry to Craignure, and then it takes about an hour and a half to drive from Craignure to Fianfort and take a ferry about 500 yards to the island of Iona. We did some hiking to some Neolithic sites as well as Celtic Christian sites. The heather was just starting to come into bloom in July. It was a beautiful time to be there. This is the Great Glen. And then the other place we went is over here. If you can, this pink area is England. We stayed at Berwick-upon-Tweed, which is the northernmost town in England. It's about 3 kilometers from Scotland, and visited the holy island of Lindisfarne, which was another Celtic outpost started from the monks on Iona. And it is a tidal island. For half of the day, it is an island, and the other half, it's connected to the mainland by mud flats. So you can walk across at low tide. It's about a 3-mile walk from the mainland to the island. But if you're smart, you only do it at low tide. Vehicles can get across too. So here is another view of the Isle of Mull and the island of Iona here. We stayed in a little town called Tobermory. That's the biggest town on Mull. This as part of our journey of family discovery. My husband's older brothers, Dan and David, and his younger sister, Tim, were with us. Dan and David's wives were with us as well. Here is the whole group of us. So this is my husband, Tim, his oldest brother, Dan, and wife, Wendy, and middle brother, David, and wife, Renee, and their younger sister, Joy. All of the McFaddens, I'll go back here just a second. The McFaddens come from Loch Buoy, this little bay here. Nowadays, there are about 17 houses there and a little chapel, and that's all. And there is a castle there that was, if you're a McFadden, you believe that this was originally the McFadden's castle, but now it belongs to the McLean family. McLeans were granted the Isle of Mull because they backed the right clan leader in a war in the 13th century. The McFaddens stayed neutral, and there you go. That's what happens to peacemakers. We found some headstones and visited some cemeteries. There are still a few McFadgens in the Loch Buoy area, and many more who have lived there in the past. This is the little chapel of Loch Buoy. It's called St. Kilda's Chapel. And around the inside of that chapel is written the Beatitudes, which, as you can see, has a special connection for me in this project. This is the Abbey at Iona. Have any of you ever visited the island of Iona? I see you nodding, Helen and Dwight. So the stone structure in the background was a later Benedictine abbey that was restored in the 20th century. But the place that I am sitting is where the scriptorium was, where the Book of Kells was created. It was a wooden building, and they have found those the wooden foundations. The stone piece right here that I'm next to is a socket for one of these standing stone crosses. There would have been a standing stone cross up here. This is a little hill, so it's raised up, and you might notice I'm wearing that same cross, and you will see that again later. So my manuscript, as a project for my sabbatical time, I wanted to do a longer lettering project. I knew I couldn't manage the whole New Testament or all the Gospels or even one Gospel, but I decided the Sermon on the Mount, just a couple chapters from Matthew, it would be a significant passage to do. It's the longest recorded speech of Jesus in the Bible. If you have a red letter Bible, it all goes red for a number of pages at that point. It's been a significant teaching for the Church of the Brethren and for many other faith traditions. And it was wonderful to enter into that text by actually forming the letters. But first I had to do some planning about the text. I laid it all out on the computer and moved around blocks of text and decided what pages I was going to have. And a significant factor was the material that it was going to be lettered on. The Book of Kells and other manuscripts that were created in the 7th and 8th century and afterward were written on animal hides. The standard was calf skin, which is called vellum. It's the same word as veal, has the same root as the word veal. But other animal skins, goat skin, sheep skin, are called parchment. I got my parchment goat skin from a supplier in New York. Has to be soaked in chemicals and have the skin scraped off of it. There's a lot to do to prepare it. And then I bought full hides. That's about 2 feet by 3 feet. My pages were roughly 8 by 10, so I could get 6 or 7 pages out of a hide. If you look, this brighter white stripe is where the backbone of the animal was. And the skin is thicker there. And traditionally, in a Western binding book where you have 2 pages that are folded and then sewn down the middle, you'd put this part in the middle, you'd have the pages on either side, and this down the middle because it's heavier to support the sewing. So if you think about a book, what is that part of the book called? The spine, that's why, because it was originally animal skin. So then I had a template and a wickedly sharp scalpel and cut through the skins, and then I'd have little offcuts left. The coloration here on the edge of the skin would have been the color of the animal, like where the animal had coloring. The finest skins, the best writing skins come from younger animals. So don't think too much about that. And then for the black, all of the lettering, nearly all of the lettering is black. I used Chinese stick ink, which I ground with an ink stone. I can show you that. Here's the scalpel that I used to cut, and then I mixed gouache or tube watercolors for the colored decoration. This was not a packing list for Scotland. I was trying to decide on the letter form, the hand that I would use. This is an abecedarian sentence. So like the quick brown fox jumps over a lazy dog. This sentence uses every letter of the alphabet. Here's the most important piece of equipment that I had for this manuscript. I had not worn glasses for 25 years, but I got a new pair of specs, and that's some of the equipment. I worked on a slanted surface so that I didn't have to bend way over to do the lettering. One of the reasons to use animal skin instead of paper is because animal skin can be corrected. If you make a mistake on a piece of paper, you cannot scrape it off and start over again. But animal skin is thicker, and I'll have some offcuts that you can see if you're interested. And it's not plant fiber that absorbs the ink. It is skin, so that ink just slides into the first layer. And so you can scrape it off and correct it. And I thought after a couple days of lettering, and I had done 3 or 4 pages, that I might not need to correct anything. And that was my first mistake. So this is a page that I skipped a line when I was working off of my notes, and had to take out most of a line, so that's scraping some off, and some more, and that's the final result. Now you might be able to see on this, I don't know how well you can. I chose to dry line my parchment, which means I didn't use a pencil or anything that left color on the parchment. I used a stylus that had a rounded end like a little ball, and actually scored the parchment. So you don't see it unless you're looking right at the right angle. But that does not get erased. That just stays on there. And then I had to letter in between those two gutters so that the ink didn't run into the indentation as I was lettering. This is much larger than the actual manuscript. And it's lettered on both sides, as you'll see if you look at the original. Those are some of the colors. They're watercolors. They're not necessarily the traditional materials that would have been used by the scribes in the 7th and 8th century. Iona may have looked like a really isolated place, but in order to create a manuscript with color on it, they needed more than 200 calf skins. So there had to be a fairly stable economy to provide that. And then the colors were things that came from all over the world. So like a royal blue, lapis lazuli blue was actually ground up lapis lazuli, which comes from the Himalayas. Some of the other colors, white would have been white lead. Yellow would have been yellow arsenic. So I did not use all traditional materials for those things, but these were colors that could be mixed with water. They dry darker than they look when they go on the page. So I had to make a lot of color samples to see what things were actually going to look like when they dried. This is St. John's Abbey in St. John's Abbey, in Collegeville, Minnesota. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the St. John's Bible. This is a Benedictine community who commissioned the St. John's Bible, which was completed in 2011. It was the first completely hand-lettered Bible since the invention of the printing press. So the first one in like 500 years. I stayed here for 2 weeks and completed my manuscript. So now I want to show you some pages from the manuscript. Don't feel like you need to read the whole thing. I'll probably go more quickly through them than you can read them. This, contrary to what you might think, this is not Jesus. He's holding a book. Can you guess who it is? It's Matthew, the evangelist Matthew. So he has a nimbus here. This image comes out of the book of Kells. He's wearing this. He has this halo around, but it doesn't have the cross shape behind, which would indicate divinity. But him holding the book makes him solidly one of the gospel writers. So the Sermon on the Mount is from the Gospel of Matthew. I use the NRSV version, and then this knotwork would have been typical of Celtic decoration and manuscripts. This is in progress of the Beatitudes. I had a different design in mind, but decided to do this one instead for the decoration. And this is the facing page that's completed. There is some gold in this manuscript. It's more difficult to see in the pictures. I used shell gold, which is ground up 24 karat gold, mixed with a little bit of binder to make it stick together, and then water, and you paint with that gold. And then you don't use that brush for anything else because you don't want to wash that gold down the sink and waste it. And it's called shell gold because the ancient scribes would have kept it in a half shell, like in half of a scallop shell. The gold that I used was about the size of an aspirin tablet. And I won't tell you how much it cost. I wanted to include some themes in this, not only some of the Celtic themes that I had studied, but places and ministries which were significant to the Church of the Brethren. So these are some Nigerian motifs on this page about salt and light. This is a Nigerian basket design. And I called Norman Carroll Waggy, who some of you may know, who had spent years in Nigeria, and said, what kind of light did you use in houses that didn't have electricity? And they said, oh, like a Coleman lantern. So that's the light there. And then I said, what did you keep salt in? And Carol said, oh, a little plastic bag. I said, well, that's not going to work. So I talked to somebody else who sent me a picture of a gourd that they would have kept salt in, and you can see the salt being scattered there. And then the facing page uses the same kente fabric design across the bottom. That's a Nigerian fabric. And it talks about not one letter, not one stroke of a letter passing away until all is accomplished. So the writing hand actually comes from the Lindisfarne Gospels, but has a little bit of a Nigerian twist to it. This is a stained glass window at the St. John's Abbey. These were the colors. This was the inspiration for the colors for the next page. So I wanted the panel across the bottom there to kind of look like a stained glass window. Now, one feature of parchment or animal skin is that it is, especially from younger animals, it's kind of translucent. You can see, you get show through from the back of the page. Can you see, can you see this kind of figure showing through here? A little face. So I had to plan the lettering on the Lord's Prayer so that it wouldn't go over that face that you see. And that's on the next page. And these are the faces of my grandchildren. My two oldest grandchildren. Monks who were working in scriptoriums wouldn't have claimed any grandchildren, but I'm not in a monastery, so I'm happy to claim mine. And my granddaughter Anna here is not really very dismal. And this is my grandson Miles. Something that was challenging about this, I told you that watercolors dry darker than when you put them on. So when I was coloring these faces, I could not see the color that I was using. I had to wait until it dried to see how it was going to come out. This is my Scottish page. You might know that thistles are the national symbol of Scotland. The panel at the bottom is the McFadden clan plaid. The McFaddens are insignificant enough that plaid wasn't widely available in Scotland when we were there, even on the Isle of Mull. But I was able to find a picture of that plaid online and incorporate it here. And you might know that thistles are mentioned in this passage of the Sermon on the Mount. So are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? So that was my tribute to our Scottish trip. This is part of a 2-page spread. with a text that I'm sure is familiar to you about considering the lilies. These were originally going to be California poppies because I grew up in California. But when we were on the island of Lindisfarne, poppies were in bloom. And that flame red color made it into the manuscript. This is a special page to me. It's the facing page to the Scottish page that I showed before. And on that page, on the facing page, it talks about good fruit coming from good plants and bad fruit coming from bad plants. This tree is the logo of my congregation, or the creekside. The water this is the logo for my congregation, and our vision is a tree that is rooted in God, growing in Jesus, and bearing fruit in the Spirit. So these are all images that would be familiar to members of my Church of the Brethren congregation. And there's that Celtic cross again that I mentioned that you had seen on the island of Lindisfarne. This is the very last, that's the very end of the Sermon on the Mount. If you have opportunity to stop by and see the manuscript, you will see the box that it's in, and I just want to go quickly a little bit about that box. Oh, here were some of my companions in my studio. This is our cat Zeke, and our cat Pepper. And we had a cherry tree felled on our property in 2020. My son-in-law Kyle is a woodworker, and he asked if we would leave lengths of trunk that he might be able to use. And we had a friend come out who has a portable sawmill, who milled the wood for us. And that was the beginning of the box. I designed the box, but it was made, it's lined with that tartan fabric. It was made by this guy here, who some of you recognize as Tim Morphew. His mother Elizabeth is here. Tim is a retired pastor and member of my congregation, and he served as clergy while I was gone for the 3 months on my sabbatical, as well as being the woodworker who made that box. So some wonderful gifts from Tim in that process. And that box has a Celtic cross inlaid on the lid. I also took a freestanding version of that cross with me to Scotland and to Minnesota when I was there at the Abbey, and a little bookmark and angel to watch over me on our travels. And then this is the before the afterword. This little parable ends the Sermon on the Mount. You're probably familiar with it, about the house on the rock and the house on sand. And I imagined that as a house that is built on the Word. And so and a house that is in a more tropical place than northern Indiana, perhaps, where some of our brethren congregations are in the Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic, or Brazil, or Spain. So I'd invite you to join me in prayer, and then we will be dismissed. Let's pray. Gracious God, we are thankful for your word, in particular your incarnate word of Jesus Christ, and also the words that we have recorded of his in the Sermon on the Mount. May they inspire us and challenge us as we go from this place. I thank you for the opportunity of letting those words be part of me, of being shaped by those words, and having the opportunity to shape those words in this manuscript. I thank you for those who are here today. bless them on their way and for the rest of this evening. In Jesus' name, amen.